Ceyla, I want to go to you first. Just remind us, this problem, has it, far from improving, actually gotten worse during the pandemic for the poorest?
Hi, Kathleen. Yes, even before the pandemic, we were warning about the debt and the debt buildup. And with the pandemic, this has become more like a tsunami of debt that is facing many countries. About half of low-income countries are either in or high risk of debt distress, and they face large debt payments over the coming years. So this is critical that we address this issue so that they can address the crisis and get out of the health and economic crisis going forward. You know that advanced economies have been providing large policy support, 24% of GDP on average. This has been less than 2% of GDP for low-income countries. So as we move into the next phase of the crisis with exiting from the health crisis, withdrawing some of the support measures, it's going to be very important to address this debt challenge the countries face.
So, Carmen, let's turn to transparency. Your op-ed, Ceyla, and you wrote, just as I say, out today, Sunday in the U.S., says transparency is a key to, unlocking the door to getting them debt relief. We hear about transparency. We hear about accountability all the time. Tell us why this isn't just a buzzword, why it really matters here.
Well, look, Kathleen, at any point in time, whether it's good times and different times or bad times, transparency is very important for monitoring, for risk assessment, surveillance. It's how can you monitor economic health without really full knowledge of a country's debts, what it owes, what are the parameters of those debts. And so it's always, transparency is always critical. However, why is it critical now? As Ceyla mentioned, the pandemic has been a tsunami. The pandemic has also been a very regressive shock in every dimension, right? Hitting the poorest within country, but also across countries. If you look at 2020, about 15% of the sovereigns in advanced economies were downgraded. Well, when you go to emerging markets and developing countries, it's 40%. So that have been downgraded. So it's not a surprise we're talking about debt problems. Why now? Why is it critical now? It's critical now because the G20 initiative, the common framework to deal with debt problems and help countries through this very difficult process, needs different creditors to come together to offer the process of concerted debt relief and organized debt relief, debt reduction. This is a problem if creditors don't trust one another. And right now we have, a very varied group of creditors. We have bondholders. We have, among the official creditors, new entrants, non-Paris Club creditors like China. So it's a complicated environment, and transparency is key for that creditor coordination.
Okay, and people getting the same data, some of this data which isn't always released in a coherent, consistent manner. So here we have the World Bank and the IMF working together. So this is obviously a big issue for these very important institutions. Ceyla, at the IMF, I understand that you are looking at the way special drawing rights, SDRs, are traded and allocated. What does that have to do with transparency in solving this problem? What are you urging people to do?
So this is transparency in terms of how public revenues are spent, in terms of building trust, in terms of with citizens, with creditors, is really very important. And in this context, you talked about SDRs, but coming back to that transparency before I go to SDRs, is public debt should be public. And it's very important. We have been focusing on this issue and working very closely with the World Bank, making sure that countries have the fiscal space to really spend on vaccines, on exiting from the health crisis, and also dealing with the economic impacts of the crisis. And that's why transparency of public expenditures, public spending, is really critical.
Okay. So as for the World Bank, Carmen, obviously you've been talking about this for a while in terms of transparency and steps that can be taken. What is it that you're urging countries to do?
Look, it's a game for where both creditors and debtors can win. Transparency is a public good. So in the process of data gathering, getting much better information from the creditors and the debtors on borrowings that go unrecorded, state enterprises that have borrowed, domestic debt, which is new to many of the low-income countries, importantly underrecorded. So there's a lot of inroads. It doesn't sound terribly exciting, this data gathering process, but it's actually quite fundamental because, we go through these boom busts again and again. And if there's any hope for getting out of this one quickly and trying to avoid the next one, I think transparency is not a buzzword. It's actually, very important for global surveillance.
Ceyla, and I want to ask you to comment on this as well, Carmen, but let's start with you, Ceyla. Is China? China is one of the new big creditors of the world. Are they being transparent enough? Are both these institutions working with the Chinese counter institutions? And of course, they're members of your groups. How about their role in making this resolution happen?
So China has, of course, a very important role to play because it's, of course, part of the G20, and the debt buildup in the last decade has been to non-Paris Club creditors, which include China as well as other countries. And the debt service suspension initiative, which the G20 put in place last March, this was after a call by IMF Managing Director and World Bank President. This has been endorsed by all G20, including, of course, China, and participated in the debt service suspension initiative, which has been really critical. Similarly, in November, leaders of the G20, including China, accepted full-heartedly the common framework for debt treatment. This is, as Carmen mentioned, really critical to address debt problems going forward. And we have been working very closely with the Chinese authorities so that they can participate and support this initiative.
So, Carmen, same question to you, and as well, hedge funds, the financial side of this, those companies and forces that are also involved in this.
Well, if you go back to the crisis of the debt crisis of the 1980s, the big unknown at the time was actually in private debt. Syndicated lending was quite opaque. We still have quite a bit of opaqueness on the private creditor side as well. Not on the same scale, of course, of the 80s, but there is much room for improvement. The Institute for International Finance that works with private creditors has, gladly that they have, started an initiative to increase also the transparency on the private side. Let me add that the area where we have actually the most transparency, though, is the area where a lot of the very intense negotiations are likely to happen, which is bondholders. Okay. And there, on their side, we have a lot of transparency, but the bondholders also have to know who the other creditors, what the other creditors' positions are.
So I want to see if I can get the same question into both you quickly, but let's start with you, Carmen, on the question of women, the most vulnerable. Crisis has hit them hard, and especially hard in these poorest of the poor countries. What needs to be done for them by the World Bank, by the IMF coming out of this?
Well, look, I mentioned at the outset that this has been a very regressive crisis, meaning it's hit the most vulnerable the most. And that includes women and girls. We are being big setbacks on schooling, girls that are taken out that will not return to school. Disproportionately, the new poor. This is a new report, well, a report late last year that the bank put out, identified women in disproportionately high share of women in the new poor. What is the World Bank doing? Well, you know, the World Bank mission to reduce poverty is a longstanding one, but part of a new flavor of the initiative is called GRID, which stands for, green and inclusive recovery, or green and inclusive development. So inclusive being part of targeting social spending on education for women.
Okay.
The report that I recently put out, my team recently put out on women, business, and the law, identifies legal issues that are still a problem for women. I mean, in 38 countries, you can still be fired for getting pregnant.
Right. Oh dear. Well, that's got to change. Oh gosh, it's hard to think back to that, and that it used to exist and it still does in some countries. Quickly to you, Ceyla, what's the one thing you think should be done for women? We're a little bit short on time now.
Okay, so it's very important to have a women lens in policies, and that's what we are pushing in our surveillance, in our lending, in our analytical work, and in our capacity development. Active policies with a gender lens, making sure that we measure it, what is the impact, and making sure that in our budgets that it's gender friendly, that the informal sector, which is housing many of the women employees, the policies are targeted at these important activities that women carry the largest burden in.